Hello and welcome to today's video. So in this one, I'm going to be painting up these awesome dwarves by Lord of War miniatures and going for a really icy, snowy theme because that's kind of what they're all about. I've been mostly using contrast paints with a dry brush and then also using my good old go-to inks for this as well, just to see how well I can pull it off, and then I'll be using some snow effects just to see how this turns out. Now before this video, I'd never done any ice stuff and I'm really pleased with how these turned out. So let's walk you through the process and talk a little bit more about these miniatures by A Lord of War Miniatures. Now at the beginning of this month, A Lord of War Miniatures reached out to me and asked did I want to print off and paint their latest set of snow dwarves. Now my first instinct was, considering I have so much that I need to paint and I was in the middle of another project at the time, was a big fat no. But then I looked a little bit closer at them and I've got to say I kind of fell in love with them straight away, and there's a number of reasons for that. First up, this dragon. It's a reindeer dragon. I mean, it's random and cool and I absolutely love it. It's got all these antlers on it and everything else. It just looks fantastic and I really like what they did with this. Then the dwarves as well. Normally dwarves, they all kind of have that same theme and they all look very similar, and although the armor and everything else does look quite similar to other dwarves that you see out there, you've got all of these massive icicle bases, you've got these cool looking weapons, and again things like your hunter here, he's got these antlers on the top where he's obviously killed one of these bad boys and worn its stuff, and that kind of got me thinking about my paint scheme and everything else. Now these miniatures are modular as well, so you've got a number of different options. You can change all the different weapons in the hands, so you've got that flexibility to mix them up how you like. Also, the main warriors that come with them, you can either print them off with helmets or without helmets. And the ones without helmets are bold, which is great for all of us follically challenged men out there. They also come with these absolutely amazing bases. I'm a massive fan of these. Normally I don't print off the bases that come with sets because they either look a little bit generic or they just kind of look like more of a pain to paint without too much of a benefit. These, however, look fantastic. They've got this kind of like just normal stone and it looks a bit cracked and everything, but then you've got all these sort of big bits of crystal ice kind of coming out of it, and I think this just helps to really tie the whole theme together. So I did print them off. They are a little on the large side. They're not like a normal 32mm base, so bear that in mind. If you're going to be printing off a load of these to have them in a regiment, they're probably going to take up quite a bit of space on your game table, but I think they look fantastic and they're well worth printing off. And you could probably do some scaling as well if you wanted to tweak them. The models do come pre-supported as well, so if you're lazy like I am, that's also really good. And one thing I will say about the supports, actually, I was really surprised they worked, because when I put them into Chistu Box, they looked as though they just weren't supporting like the top half, and I just thought they were going to fail. But actually, there's quite minimal amount of supports on these, and they all came off perfectly, and I had no issues at all. So I printed them all off, and I kind of sat, and I thought, what the hell do I want to do with the paint scheme? And to be honest, I wasn't too sure. At first, for some reason, it didn't really click that they were really icy and everything else, and then I kind of read the title of the actual pack and saw all the ice and everything, and it just made sense that I'd have to go for some kind of snowy ice theme. I wasn't too sure what colours to use, but I had in my head that I was going to go for the same sort of contrast paint with a dry brush approach that I've used in past videos. But I started off with the dragon, and it's just because this is a larger model and it figured I could have a bit of fun with it. I'd just done all of my priming, and for priming I used my usual grey undercoat with a white Liquitex ink over the top of it just to kind of really pull out some of those colours for contrast paints. Now I'm not going to bore you too much with the details of the dragon itself, just because I didn't film that, because I know I'll end up spray painting my camera like an absolute idiot, and yeah, I don't want to do that. But do let me know in the comments, do you want to see bigger overviews when I do things like these dragons and everything else, or do you just want me to continue concentrating on the actual painting side of things on the smaller miniatures? Let me know in the comments, just that way I can make maybe separate videos or put a bit more focus on these. So I hit it off with Ultramarine Air by Army Painter, and then I used this Liquitex ink over the top, which is muted turquoise, and the kind of finish looks really good. I then hit it with an Infomatic Blue, just to really kind of make some of those highlights pop, and then I used a Liquitex white ink over the top to really bring out those highlights. Keeping that in mind, I then went across onto the dwarves, and I figured I will do pretty much exactly the same as that, just obviously with a paintbrush rather than an airbrush. So first up, I used the contrast paint Ultramarine Blue, and these do look a little bit like mini Ultramarine, so that is kind of one thing to bear in mind. At the end of this, you'll see I kind of wish I went with some more highlights just to make it pop a little bit more, but actually I think the ultramarine blue looked really good as a start. I did try it with just Infomatic Blue as like the main colour for the armour, but it just looked a little bit washed out and watercoloury and just didn't work in my opinion. So ultramarine blue was what I used for all of the armour, thinking that I'd come back in, obviously, and highlight it and just try to make it pop a little bit more with a dry brush. And I've got to say, I really like the way it turned out. It is a bit dark and it does look a little bit like, obviously, an ultramarine as you would expect given the colour I've used, but I think it looks pretty good and it contrasts nicely with the weapons. Moving across onto those weapons, I used this Infomatic Blue and I love it. I think it came out really well. Obviously, all the weapons and the ice as well, I used it on pretty much everything else on this model, so I could just make it really pop. Now the great thing about this is because I'd used that Zenithal Prime highlight underneath it, you've still got a lot of those areas where those highlights pop through the contrast paint and start to add and lend itself to this icy theme, and it looks really good once you get it done. So as well as the weapons, like I said, it's pretty much everything else, so like the antlers, the ice, any of the spikes that were on there as well, they all got that Infomatic Blue coat as well. For the cloaks, I used Pterodon Turquoise, and I think it gave a really nice sort of match between the weapons and also the armour. Probably looks a little bit too close to the Infomatic Blue at the end of the day, but actually it looks nice enough. And in my opinion, it looks as though these guys are sent off into the mountains to slay one of these reindeer dragons, then skin him, so that way you've got that for your cloaks, and take things like his antlers to either wear on your head or turn into a weapon, or maybe craft some of these weapons from this ice. So at the end of the day, it all blends nicely and it matches that lore that I've got in my head for it, whether or not that makes any sense. But I do actually really like the way that turned out as well. Moving across onto things like the beards, obviously, it was just really a mix. I used things like Nazdrake Yellow because I didn't want to go too bright for all of them. I also used a mix of Skeleton Horde and Apothecary White. So I used a 50-50 mix of that just to get these white beards that you'll see here as well. I didn't want to go too white because I think it would just look a little bit like Father Christmas, but that sort of mix seemed to work really nicely. And then I used a nice bright orange contrast paint for this kind of Lord Dwarf here, so that way he'd really stand out. In terms of things like the bells that they've got on the end of the beards and the weapon shafts and everything else, I used snakebite leather for that, just to kind of mix it up. For the flesh, I used Gilliman's flesh. It's just my go-to one that I always go to because it's fantastic, and it made these look really, really nice. In terms of the bases, obviously I've used Infomatic Blue for all of the ice, but I actually used this Griff Charger Grey for the bases because it's got a nice blue tint to it, and that way it really matched and kind of blended in with the ice. It had a nice transition between those icicles into the rock, and then it also matched things like the armour and everything else. So that Griff Charger Grey actually came in really, really nicely. When I first started putting it on, I felt it looked a little bit too light, but once it dried, it blended in very, very nicely with the rest of the model. Now at this point, they were looking obviously a little bit flat, but of course I went with my good old blue skink, or skink blue dry by Citadel. I don't know if they still do these. I've got it left over from a long time ago. But basically what you want to be looking for is a really nice bright blue, which is relatively close to this Infomatic Blue, a little bit brighter than it. And at the end of the day, I think this adds a really, really nice contrast across the whole thing. So literally I smashed this all over. So I had it on the armor, especially concentrating on the tops of it. I used it on the weapons as well, just to really bring out some of the bright points in the blades, and it started to look fantastic. I also used it on things like the icicles and the rocks and everything else just to give it a bit of a glow, and the end result was really good. I was really happy with how that turned out. Once I'd done that, it was across on to my inks, and this time instead of going for just a generic black or a brown like I've done in the past, I decided I wanted to mix it up. So for the armor, I used this, which is Winton Oil Colour French Ultramarine. So as you can see, there's an ultramarine theme coming through here, and it just really helped to darken some of those points. For the weapons, I used Viridian Hue, and that gave it a really nice kind of dark point around some of the areas as well. And then for things like the flesh and also the beards as well, I used this, which is Burnt Sienna, and it really helped to bring out some of the detail of things like the beards and also around the muscles and everything else. So really liked this combination. To mix these up, I've done videos on that beforehand, so go over and check it out. But basically, in a nutshell, I mix them so they're quite wet and they're a nice runny consistency. I don't want to have it too thick because then that starts to kind of really darkened down some of the areas, and it's just a bit more of a pain in the cleanup process. Once that had dried, I left it for about 20 to 30 minutes. I don't leave it for too much longer than that. I just grab one of these makeup sponges, go over it, and start to take it all off of the high points, and at that point you are pretty much done. I could leave them at this point in my opinion, and they would look good enough. But I went back in and just did some highlighting of the armor and stuff like that, just to kind of really bring out some of those details. Now, once that was done, I wasn't too sure what to do, so I picked up this Army Painter like snow texture and I threw it all over the bases. I sprinkled some on the dwarves themselves as well, so trying to kind of collect it where I think snow would probably go on armor, so around I guess the crevices and stuff like that, where they've got the hands raised, kind of down there, maybe on the bottoms of the weapons, around the boots and everything else. Now, when I first threw this on there, I wasn't too keen. It just looked like someone had got some laundry powder and just chucked it on my models, and it didn't look right. So I used this really high gloss varnish, and this is when things started to look really good in my opinion. I went over all the bases at first, and I kind of just soaked it in there. And at that point, it started to kind of give it a really, really icy look rather than just this powdery snow. And it blended in the crystals and it blended in the snow that I'd put down, and it made it look awesome. I then threw it all over the models as well, so anywhere there was snow patches on the models, I dabbed a bit of varnish on there as well, and it helped again to give it that sort of like ice crystal look. So on the bottom of some of the weapons too, I stuck some varnish on it just to give it a bit of a glint. Once the varnish had dried, it kind of pulled it all together. It kept all of that snow flocking together, nothing was falling off, and it just made it look really icy and gave it a nice bit of a shine in the areas I wanted to. I made sure all the ice crystals that were sticking out of the bases, they were all coated in that high gloss varnish as well, because it really gave them that icy appearance. And at that point, I called it done. And I've got to say, I really like the way these turned out. I just think they look fantastic. They're different to anything I've painted beforehand. I normally don't paint dwarves. I've only painted, I think, one in my entire lifetime. But I really like the way these turned out. I could have maybe gone over with a metallic dry brush as well just to make it pop, but I liked the idea that this was all some kind of like magical armor that had been carved from these and the crystals and everything else, and I do like the way they look. In hindsight, the one thing that I probably would do is go back in and get some really bright highlights on there as well, maybe the tops of the armor, tops of the weapons and stuff like that, just to make it really pop. But I think with relatively minimal effort, these turned out pretty damn good, and I'd be interested to know what you guys think as well, so throw that down in the comments below. I do still need to paint the dragon's rider. I've got it to a stage that I'm quite happy with. Maybe needs a little bit more detail work around the wings and like the webbing and stuff like that, but again, I like it. It blends nicely with the rest of the dwarves. It just needs to do his rider and some extra bits there. But overall, these dwarves I'm going to call finished, and I really, really like them. So Lord of War Miniatures, thank you so much for sending these over. I've had an absolute blast painting them, and I definitely recommend go check out their Patreon. They've got some fantastic files there, and they're a relatively new and upcoming 3D printing modeling company. And I've got to say, I was really impressed. When I saw that they didn't have that many patrons, I kind of figured, well, what's the quality of this stuff going to be like? They're really, really good. High praise, absolutely love them, and had a blast painting these. So once again, hope you've enjoyed that video, and if you have, hit the like and subscribe button to come along for some more 3D printing and painting content in the future. If you want to support the channel in any way, I'll have most of my stuff linked down below. It's an affiliate link, so if you do buy anything, I do get a bit of a kickback from it, but it doesn't cost you any extra. I've also got all my gear listed across on my website as well, so if you want to check that out, by all means, head on over there and check it out. Also, if you want to get any deeper, I do have a Patreon set up as well, so by all means, come over, check that out, and that just helps me to keep on making these videos, buying all the different files and paints and resources and stuff like that, and bringing the content over for you. In the meantime, stay safe. I'll see you soon. Bye.